Tonight I want to focus on our plan in one of those key areas, pension funds.
Okay. This is not a podcast about the news. As I wanted to do a series about pensions, I thought it's a very fundamental topic that is not covered enough. I recorded on Monday, 11th of November, an enlightening conversation with Alishya Hartington Clark, DC specialist at the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association. And as I was about to publish, 3 days later, there was a speech by the new Chancellor with a plan.
Start the most significant set of changes to the pensions landscape since the Turner Review.
It turned out that so much we discussed during this conversation is relevant to the proposed reform. So I'm posting a segment of this conversation because if you want to understand this most significant reform plan and how it may play out between the announcement last week and its implementation, which will take some time, I think this conversation will be very helpful. But remember, it's not a commentary on the news. It was recorded before, and I think it's an evergreen conversation. So if you also want to understand the dynamics, the challenging, the opportunities that may always be there, always be important for pensions and not just in the UK, you will also enjoy this conversation with Alishya Hartington Clark from the PLSA. Let's look at what's happening now on this side and what do we see as the key initiative and potential changes.
In DC, the government and regulatory focus on investment has shifted much more towards UK alternative assets. What do I mean by that? I wouldn't want to hedge a bet, to be honest, because the government itself hasn't been super clear what it means. It uses lots of different terms interchangeably to suggest that they want sort of greater risk-seeking, greater UK-focused assets, bit more risk on, bit more UK tilt.
One acronym that I saw is LTAF.
Yeah, LTAFs. Long-term asset funds, they're one of the many initiatives that the regulators have tried in recent times to shift the UK DC industry towards more risk-seeking assets, basically. This is all very well where the risk-return profile adds up. The problem is some of these assets that the government is interested in theoretically either don't exist, like from a pipeline perspective, they're not there. You know, there just aren't the opportunities that they describe, even theoretically, or they're very expensive or very, very risky. And so from a DC perspective, if you're sort of playing around with one person's pound that they're hoping to live off in the future and it might be £1.20, you're probably not going to necessarily be super keen to throw that money into either very, very expensive or very, very risky assets in a very overweight way. You might allocate a small amount, but you're not going to allocate nearly the sorts of percentages that the UK government would love to have in order to, you know, facilitate infrastructure projects and whatnot. So there are two drivers here that the government is grappling with. It's their own interests in trying to get UK productive assets and UK growth and, you know, a green economy and all of these very highly admirable things. And I wouldn't diminish the need for all of those things. But the problem is, from a sort of UK DC perspective, they're not necessarily the most attractive assets that you would select as an investment professional on behalf of others. So there are some different benefits and risks associated with those assets that the government is trying to look at. You know, they've looked at, like you said, things like LTAFs, they've looked at things like the charge cap, they've tried to think about, you know, fiscal incentives. There are all sorts of different factors that they've, but, you know, ultimately, sadly, if the UK underperforms its peers, like as a global economy, if the UK underperforms, then they just don't look that attractive as assets. So regardless of whether they're alternative or not. So it's sort of, it's a bit of a difficult one. We're constantly struggling to suggest those things that would make a meaningful difference, if that's the government's intent.
Yeah, I totally get it from a UK perspective. Let's say, okay, we're going to invest in growth industries, green industries, in the UK, and those will perform fantastically.
Yeah.
This is not a prediction, it's a hypothetical quote. And we're solving all the problems at once. Growth,
100%.
green,
Yeah.
pension. What's really interesting from what I hear is the dynamics, what do you call it, a negotiation or an ongoing discussion, and it's between the government and who is on the other side play out.
Yeah, I'm not sure per se it's a sort of negotiation. It's more just an ongoing discussion and like meeting of minds, I would say. It's not really it's more about trying to find ways to meet that sort of sweet spot of ultimate goals combined, like you described. Oh, ideally, we'd all have all of those things. We would balance growth, we would balance member outcomes, we'd do that in a well-governed structure. There'd be loads of assets, there'd be a pipeline of investable assets, there'd be fiscal incentives for UK staff, there would be big industrial strategy with green transition, all of these things. Ideally, all of these things would happen. So I think it's not per se like a negotiation. It's more just been everyone trying to find the piece of the puzzle that they can add to that UK growth dynamic.
Ultimately, from the pension members, what matters with this money is how do I retire, right?
Yes, 100%.
Maybe there's something about, I feel even better in my retirement because I've done green, meaningful project. If I'm being very cynical, I would say, maybe, and looking back, and it's past performance, doesn't mean like it's the future results, the whole UK, the whole universe would have been done very well by investing simply in the S&P 500 of US equities because they've done so well.
Yep.
What I really like to keep from that is that it's a trade-off and it's being discussed, and it's not like the government can say, whatever, we do a special fiscal incentive, and now we kind of force you by changing the regulation, and everybody's going to go there.
I think, it's a dialogue. And I think also it's about those assets, it's finding the assets, finding the opportunities. And if they're there, pension schemes will have them. Pension schemes will never shy away from the things that they need. And it's just that sometimes their needs are a bit more complex than it appears. And you're right, on an individual basis, some individuals are taking choices about their savings that are about green economy or about whatever their sort of ethical or otherwise views about, the future society in which they want to live in. And that's not necessarily about return, though it could be. It's sometimes about their feeling towards that future society that they want to build. And some pension schemes are taking choices like that as well, but it's not that straightforward. You can't have an ethical perspective in quite the same way as a sort of, a very, very large investor. It's just not how it works. So I think it is about balancing that, the two sides of the coin. It's about finding those opportunities and those opportunities meeting the needs of savers. And that's hard. It's not straightforward.
It's not straightforward. It's also a good outlook in terms of pension reform. What I've learned is that it's not that easy for the government. There's been many attempts in the UK with some measure of success. But the fact that the UK is doing pretty well, contrary to what we typically expect when we hear about pensions, because we only hear about them when there's something being disrupted, when there's something going wrong, perhaps this dynamic tension between the government on one side, industry bodies, product providers, and so on, which might be frustrating for some, might be the right approach. But what's eventually also missing from all this is that the pension conversation has become an individual one, as defined contribution scheme seem to take over, although that's less the case in the UK than other countries. We've got more freedom, more empowerment, but also a lot more risk, personal risk in terms of our pension. And what the government, the industry, and everyone else is doing is perhaps not as important as the individual decisions that we will make, whether we want to be an investor or not.